Good morning, everybody, or actually good afternoon. I'm Tino Cuellar, the president of the Carnegie Endowment. It's great to see all of you here at an event that reflects a tremendous amount of work that has been done on this task force. You know that we've made progress when you have a nice physical manifestation of it. Not only that, we've got nice pictures and colors. But what really matters here? Let me take a step back and make 4 points. The first one is that about a year ago, when we started this task force, with the help of many of you, task force members, and the interest of many of you, we understood that there was a real need to be honest about the challenge the U.S. faced in reconciling a set of goals. It's fine to talk about a clean energy transition. It's important to talk about how that has an impact on U.S. strategic interests, how that has an impact on countries around the world. But how to reconcile effectively multiple considerations that are hard to reconcile. One is an American strategic interest, not only in the energy sector and its own energy security, but a set of foreign policy goals that cuts across pretty much every international agency. Two, the interests of other countries, some competitors, some who collaborate with us when they can or when we can, some that are friends, but that don't see the world necessarily the way the United States does. Three, how to take into account not only American strategic interests, but also the needs and concerns of working Americans who work in factories, in manufacturing, in the tech sector, in agriculture, and have a stake in what happens around energy. And then four, how to keep in mind the energy transition itself and how we're doing. Now, if you know Carnegie, and most of you do, you know that we're not in the business of pie-in-the-sky thinking. We're in the business of intellectual honesty. So that requires us to be honest about the fact that despite technological progress, the backdrop for the work of this task force was the need to reach a level of investment that is about $5.6 trillion between now and 2030. And we're nowhere near that level of investment. So, point number one is that the challenge that this task force took on was real, and it had to do with reconciling some factors that require four-dimensional chess to do so. The second point is about the importance of this supply chain issue, and particularly the clean energy supply chain issue, to U.S. national security. When we think about the needs of the U.S.'s military, the needs of the critical infrastructure sector that provides the underpinning of American power around the world, there is no question that that is going to require not only attention to energy writ large, but to a growing share of energy that comes from renewable sources. How do we assure that? How do we work together with the right group of countries to make sure that we can provide for American security? Three, our premise, but one that has been borne out by the terrific work done by this task force, is that in achieving those national security objectives, the U.S. cannot go it alone. The questions and judgment calls that are made about what countries are in what level of a set of concentric circles are hard and important and have been part of what this task force has deliberated on. But at the end of the day, the idea that all of the U.S.'s energy needs and that the energy transition that needs to happen here and that U.S. can help catalyze around the world can happen effectively with just resources inside U.S. borders, we know is not realistic. And again, I return to the intellectual honesty point. The last point I want to make is about teamwork. I am really struck by the level of dedication and persistence that has been shown by the Carnegie team working on this. Noah Gordon, whom you'll hear from in a minute, Dan Baer, our senior vice president, Milo McBride, and so many of you who have been here. I would like to ask our task force members to stand for a moment if you are on the task force. I know a number of you are here, and I'd like to give you a hand of applause. Because we know we do feed you sometimes, but you're not coming here for the food. You're here because the work matters, and you understand that we don't get somewhere if we're not intellectually honest. Finally, this is, in some sense, the completion of a process that began a while ago and that has produced not only this element of the task force's work here, but several reports. But I want to emphasize that this is not the end for us. It is only the end of the beginning, to channel previous statesperson. And as I think about our partners, including Sequoia Climate Fund and others that have stepped up to the plate to help us do this, I'm really looking forward to making sure we take these recommendations and ideas and recognize that the foundation we're laying here is not about one administration. It's not about one term, presidential term. It's not about one country. It is about American security and American needs, and it's going to require a lot of work of implementation, cutting across administrations that will keep us all busy probably for a decade or more. So with very much the hopes in mind that we will be able to work together and partner on that effort, I look forward to the progress that we'll make here, laying things out, and the collaborations that we will have in the years to come. Thank you very much. Thank you. And now you get to hear from someone much more interesting, the person of the hour, Noah Gordon.
Thanks so much, Tino, and thanks to you all for being here. I'm Noah Gordon, a fellow in the Sustainability, Climate, and Geopolitics Program. As you can probably hear, I lost my voice yesterday. I was hoping I would sound raspy like Bob Dylan. I think I sort of sound hoarse like Doc Rivers or Michael Cera with a bad hangover. But we continue. If there's anything the climate community knows, it's about dealing with adversity. So I want to echo Tino by thanking the members of the task force. You know, we had 23 members who met over 12 months, put out 15 papers. In addition to the reports you see before you today, there's papers from task force members. We had Sarah Bloom-Raskin on how the Treasury could finance something like a clean energy Marshall Plan abroad, Varun Sivaram on opportunities in solid-state batteries, DJ Nordquist on why energy should be a part of an all-of-the-above energy strategy, and many more. So thanks to you for being here. We're going to present some of the main takeaways from the report, me and my colleagues Milo McBride and Bentley Allen. So in our summary report, we identify a problem with three aspects. First, that clean energy technologies are essential to the U.S.'s economic future. Second, that competition is heating up. And third, that the U.S. is way behind and losing the race at the moment. Why is clean energy essential to the U.S.'s economic future? Tino touched on it a little bit, but it's not just because lower emissions mean a safer climate for everyone. Hold on, let me grab the slides here. It's also because the rise of clean energy is inevitable. You can see here global energy investment in clean energy and fossil fuels. And while annual global investment in fossil fuels is stagnant at around $1 trillion per year, clean energy investment is growing at about 25% per year and topped $2 trillion last year. So we can have different views about when fossil fuel consumption may peak. Most forecasters look at facts like how global sales of internal combustion engine vehicles peaked back in 2018 and expect global fossil fuel consumption to peak before 2030 and plateau and then slowly decline thereafter. But even if you think otherwise and think there'll be an LNG boom and fossil fuel consumption will keep growing slowly for longer, it's clear where the future area of explosive growth, of innovation is, and the area from which economic power and geopolitical strength will derive. So these technologies, solar panels, batteries, heat pumps, and more, they're more efficient. There's less waste heat and less energy. And importantly, for many countries, there's less wasted money, especially foreign exchange. I mean, some of you may have seen the solar boom in Pakistan over the last few years where they added 50% to their grid. That was that's something that they did so they didn't have to waste money on importing constant flows of foreign molecules. And that's also a country that many Americans hoped might be a big market for U.S. LNG exports in the future, but we have to see that the tide is turning in some countries like that. So second, on the competition heating up, you know, those solar panels in Pakistan were Chinese, and China is doubling down. You'll see in our summary report that China's share of clean energy supply chains actually increased from 2021 to 23, despite the big investments that the U.S. and others were making. And clean energy actually contributed 10% of Chinese GDP last year. So this is already big business. Half of Chinese exports of clean energy technologies go to the global south. So this isn't something that can be determined by North American or European policy or otherwise. And we also see Beijing responding to U.S. export controls on semiconductors by restricting the exports of minerals that we need for defense and clean energy alike. But this is a global story. It's not just China. We're speaking today as the EU Clean Industrial Deal was announced. We also see big investments being made by the Gulf states in solar and critical minerals. Saudi Arabia will actually invest more in renewables and in clean hydrogen over the next 5 years than in upstream oil and gas, which is certainly a big shift. And Brazil, too, has a new clean energy industrial strategy. And third, on the U.S. being way behind, you've probably seen graphs like this before showing Chinese manufacturing dominance and the U.S. lagging behind. That's where we stand today. But for the task force, in our data analysis, we also wanted to look to the future and try to see what sort of production would be needed by 2035 to have the world on track to hit net zero by 2050. Some of those supply chains, we have lighter lifts. As you can see, solar, there's not much growth needed, wind as well, and even for batteries, it seems like a manageable increase over the next 10 years. Other technologies, it's a much heavier lift ahead of the world. You see advanced or enhanced geothermal, where the US is sort of a rare area where the US could be a world leader, and direct air capture, which is so far off track that you can't even fit it on the slide. That's probably a topic for another conference. But we wanted to think that, for a US policymaker, global production isn't the only thing that matters. National prosperity and resilience matter as well. So we tried a different perspective that we call the ex-China framework. I'll just explain it first. This is a hypothetical, provocative scenario where the non-Chinese world would have to supply its own clean energy technologies in 2035. Of course, Chinese exports can and should fill some of those gaps, but in some areas that's not possible and it's not desirable either. So we tried to see how much production would need to increase to hit those targets. And even though batteries were a lighter lift from a global perspective, from an ex-China perspective, you see really significant growth needed by 2035. And importantly here, this isn't just the current manufacturing needing to grow by this much. We also put together a project pipeline looking at a number of sources from around the world to see what sort of manufacturing capacity we expect to come online in the next years. And still you see significant growth needed all across the supply chain, not to mention in the upstream minerals, where the Trump administration says it wants to achieve energy dominance. So just to conclude and pass over to Bentley, the US and its allies face a serious challenge. Whether we like it or not, we are in a clean energy race and we are currently losing. So you'll now hear from my colleagues about our reports where we have ideas to hopefully turn things around. So Bentley, over to you.
It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm Bentley Allen. I'm a non-resident scholar here at Carnegie. During my day job, I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins University, where I teach international relations and energy policy, as well as industrial policy. And I want to start by giving a little bit of a professorial diversion into trying to understand the core principles of geopolitics. And I think this is important in an age in which we're heading into a lot of geopolitical uncertainty. We're coming out of an age of a lot of geopolitical uncertainty, and we're now heading into one with even more geopolitical uncertainty. So it helps in these times to ground ourselves and to remind ourselves of the core principles that will really help us to understand where we're at. The core principle I want to share with you is that in a geopolitical competition, the way you win, the way you gain advantage, the way you actually prosper in a geopolitical competition is by maximizing the freedom of maneuver that you have. You don't want your adversaries to have leverage over you, and you don't want your adversaries to have leverage over your allies. So for example, the United States in 1945 was an oil exporting power. It had plenty of oil to meet its domestic demand, but it still went to the trouble to create energy dominance in the Middle East through a set of hierarchical relationships with the existing governments there, precisely because it wanted to keep Europe off of Soviet oil. So it was deemed to be in the US national interest, not just to look after its own domestic sources of energy, but actually to help its allies maintain their freedom of maneuver vis-a-vis a geopolitical adversary. I would submit we're in the same situation today, where US national interest is, in fact, co-equal with its international standing in the world. And that's what I want to talk to you about for a few minutes here. So technological leadership and manufacturing capacity are now the coin of the realm. It's not just the flows of oil and fossil fuels that we need to build capacity in, it's actually technological leadership that we need to achieve. In order to achieve that technological leadership, we're going to need strong international partnerships, precisely because many of the critical minerals that the United States needs are just not in the ground here, and even if they are in the ground here, they're not available economically for the United States to achieve. So we're going to need the Canadians, the Australians, the South Koreans to mine and process materials on our behalf. But we're also going to need Zambia, we're also going to need Indonesia, we're going to need other countries as well to be part of this international partnership. But also on those technologies where we want to compete, these are global value chains where the knowledge that is necessary to execute and innovate across these value chains is distributed globally, right? And that means that actually if we want to build better solar panels here in the United States, we need our Korean partners to be at our side in order to achieve an innovative domestic supply chain. So To enhance freedom of maneuver, the United States has to strategically construct networks of allies that are capable of both producing clean energy minerals and clean energy technologies. Now, in this context, if you want to be a leader, you're going to need some followers, right? The problem in the current geopolitical order is that followers have options, and they have good options, because China has been going out and cultivating decent economic relationships with countries all through the world, whether it's through the Belt and Road or now the Global Development Initiative and various other overseas investments. The solar panels in Pakistan that Noah just mentioned are an excellent example of this kind of investment, right? In fact, the Gulf states are paying for most of those solar panels in Pakistan because they see the need to economically diversify. And one of the ways that they're going to do that is by taking a stake in mines and solar farms and geothermal projects all over the world. This investment that China has done has provided these countries not only with an ability to reduce their dependence on foreign imports, which reduces their currency dependency and provides them with freedom of maneuver domestically. So these countries actually like importing clean energy for this exact reason, and that's why Pakistan installed at least 17 gigawatts of solar last year, which would have put it third on the list, just behind the United States, between the United States and Brazil, in terms of global installation. Saudi Arabia, by the way, would be not much further below that. Saudi Arabia does not publish how much solar they're installing in their economy, but they imported from China 10 gigawatts if you look at the trade data. So they imported 10 gigawatts of solar panels to install in their own projects. And what this means is that bullish bets on global oil demand, which were premised upon the developing world, upon emerging markets using large amounts of oil in their energy mix, are probably going to lead to stranded assets, and they're probably going to leave us in a difficult financial position if we put a bunch of resources into that at the current moment. And it also means that the offer that we would be giving these countries, which is further dependency on us, is not a very attractive one, right? A far more attractive offer to those countries would be to invest in their supply chains, invest in their manufacturing and value-added processing, which is, of course, precisely what these countries say they want when you ask them what they want. So if we really want to rebuild geopolitical advantage with our international partners in the global South, then what we're going to need to do is make real concrete investments that leave them better off than we found them. And that means building value-added and manufacturing processing in those other countries. So the U.S. needs a concrete strategy to build clean energy supply chains in this way, but also to cultivate that diplomatic support that we want if we really want to lead in the new geopolitical order. And this strategy has got to do something not just geopolitically, the geopolitical challenge is hard enough, but actually the policy challenge is really difficult. And actually one way to read the first Trump administration and the Biden administration together on this is to say that we did lots of really interesting experiments, and now it's the time to harvest those experiments and bring them together into a coherent, comprehensive system that will allow the United States to actually compete. So that's where our recommendations in this report on geopolitical advantage, which is also summarized in the summary for policymakers, the main report that you have today. So there are 5 elements to a framework that can actually deliver on this. The first is laying out some actual targets. The PGI is absolutely the right idea. The Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment that the Biden administration launched is absolutely the right idea. But the PGI the engagements of the PGI was often determined by the schedules of the principals rather than what we would actually want to focus our energies on. If you look at the supply chain data that Noah presented, that presents us with those key points, those key geopolitical and bottlenecks in the supply chains that we need to focus on. And then we should identify the best countries that could produce and help us to alleviate those geopolitical tensions, and invest in those countries and invest in those specific supply chains. So the PGI needs to be a lot more targeted. But at the same time, it also, in a way, paradoxically, it needs to be focused by becoming more targeted, but it also needs to be broadened by bringing together a variety of initiatives, such as support for industrial policy, finance for strategic investment, and market creation and market shaping. So I'm just going to say a few words about each of these elements of the framework. So if we have targets, then that will lead us to go out into the world and find the best projects to create a coherent project pipeline. And we can do this in a variety of ways. The friend of the task force, our member of the task force, Katie Auth, has written a great proposal for energy security compacts, which would help us to organize that project pipeline domestically, and we incorporated that into our recommendations, and she wrote a standalone piece for the task force as well. And that project pipeline would tell us, which projects we're actually trying to develop in an active framework. But then those successful projects that are being moved through the pipeline, they need three kinds of support. First of all, the receiving country for that project needs supportive, good, strong industrial policy in that country. But actually, we just spent the last 30 years telling all these countries in the global south that they shouldn't do industrial policy, so they're not that great at it, actually. And we actually need to provide them with technical and financial assistance. Technical assistance in terms of what kinds of R&D should you do? Can we help you with that R&D? And actually just advice on what good industrial policy is. And actually, the Biden administration pioneered some of this through the Clean Energy Supply Chain Collaborative. It did bilaterals with Kenya, Brazil, and India, in which it was helping to have those countries identify the best priority areas that they could invest in, and then give them good advice on how to do that industrial policy. And some of the work of the task force fed into that process within the National Security Council. So we need to support industrial policy in these other countries, but then we also need to mobilize finance. But we need to do so in a more focused way than was being done under the PGI. That partly means making sure that EXIM, DFC, and the other pots of money that we have internationally are strategically focused on the priority sectors rather than just dispersed, or rather than being determined by log rolling in Congress, which also tends to happen. And then international partnerships like other sovereign wealth funds, other pots of money that have been created through G7 and G20 initiatives can also be brought into this, and the World Bank and the other regional development banks can also be brought into the strategic process as well. But for many of these clean energy technologies, we need market creation activities. It's not just enough to produce the thing, we have to create demand for the thing. The global arrangement for sustainable steel and aluminum was an effort to try to create demand for clean steel, which we're going to have to do if we want to both de-risk ourselves from dependence on Chinese steel and build up new clean technology pathways. That was a market creation effort. We're going to need that in a lot of these cases, and we've arrayed some of the tools here. Tariffs, again, are an important tool of market creation, but they shouldn't just be used willy-nilly to try to discipline or to try to gain advantage over other countries. So what we can do in this framework is bring together both the supply push policies that good industrial policy gives us that advance technologies, and the demand pull policies that are needed to bring those technologies into international markets that are secure from geopolitical competition. So in short, the Trump administration has said that it wants to do a number of things. It wants to achieve energy dominance. It wants to rebuild domestic manufacturing. It wants to drive and attract foreign direct investment into the United States. It wants to create resilient critical mineral supply chains. And that it doesn't want China to win the race for the future. It wants to be able to compete technologically on the technologies of the future. In fact, Senator Rubio's office was really articulate on this point last fall. So the recommendations that are in this report are how you can realistically achieve all of those goals. But it's going to take a disciplined, focused effort that builds on the success of the Biden administration internationally, but also it's going to take a domestic industrial policy to be successful as well. And Milo is going to tell us a little bit about some of these efforts.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Milo McBride. I'm a fellow here at Carnegie. I focus on the geopolitics of energy technology, and I've had the pleasure of co-managing this task force over the past year. Today, I'm going to be presenting on U.S. foreign policy for energy technology and minerals, the observations that we've found thus far, and then I'll conclude with some final remarks and recommendations, both sectoral, specific recommendations, but also macro sentiments that we could take away from this research. I want to begin by acknowledging that foreign policy for energy technologies and minerals is a relatively new facet of U.S. diplomacy and trade agendas. It does not have the same inherent know-how of traditional energy sources. But that despite some of the shifts we may see for U.S. energy and foreign policy right now, as my colleagues highlight, a concerted foreign policy strategy for energy technology and minerals will be essential for the U.S. to engage in these systems of the future. To begin, I'm going to take stock of what has been done thus far over the past 2 administrations. Overall, there have been some mixed results. Some important bilateral and multilateral architectures have been erected, namely for minerals and nuclear sectors. But there's also some interesting takeaways from project finance across the myriad of the verticals that we illustrate. Overall, some political capital was expensed in areas of low return. And I emphasize this on hydrogen being an overly emphasized point of focus. But there was also perhaps a too broad a focus on technology verticals and not one that focused in on certain supply chain risks, perhaps solar ingots or wafers, active anode material or spherical graphite for batteries, and looking at broad technology verticals without focusing on the specific sectors of importance, geothermal, whereas the key area of interest is enhanced or advanced geothermal systems. Nonetheless, important forward movements were made, and the takeaways from these two administrations offer important lessons going forward. I want to begin with this graphic that illustrates where the U.S. has engaged bilaterally for its clean energy partnerships. You see that the countries highlighted range in color, and those colors illustrate the depth of pacts that those partnerships cover. You see also a range of OECD and BRICS countries in this grouping. We can start with the top, India, Brazil, Japan. They have about 11 sectors in their clean energy agreements. They're comprehensive. They include industrial decarbonization, sustainable aviation fuels, and the Japanese have a specific science diplomacy, R&D for nuclear fusion. The Brits do as well. When you go down the roster to some more usual suspect countries, you see France, Germany, Norway. These are quite comprehensive as well. As I mentioned, they span the gamut of technology verticals, but there's few exceptions of specific subsectors within those technologies. I think France is an interesting one where the French have been adamant not just on collaborating on hydrogen, but on geologic hydrogen, which the French see as a high-risk, high-reward opportunity. Of course, it's a nascent development, but an interesting one to look at nonetheless. When we go down, we look to many commodity-rich countries, Argentina, Chile, Zambia. There are a couple clean tech sectors illustrated there, but the focus, of course, is on diversifying mineral supply chains, the likes of which for lithium, copper in particular. But these are just diplomatic overtures. These do not dictate or shape markets. They are political aspirations. And to go further, we give you this graphic. All of this is outlined in the report, Minerals, Markets, and Manufacturing, that's available here. We look at 40 countries, and we tally up where diplomatic engagements were leveraged. You see that in the dark blue dots, or squares rather. And then we ask, where is there actual market-shaping incentives? Where is there some sort of pledge to do more on developing supply chain? So this is not pledges for a solar farm, it's pledges for solar manufacturing, right? And we describe this project is really focused on that question of supply chain and not deployment. And what you see is not surprising, that a lot more was done on the diplomatic side than we were able to actually finance and come through on. You take Canada, for example, there's funding for minerals that comes from the Defense Production Act for cobalt and graphite. The Department of Energy had pilot funding for carbon capture technology. And then EVs, of course, were integrated into the Inflation Reduction Act's 30D subsidy that allows, kind of builds on the USMCA agreement. Yeah, I recommend going through it. Digitally, it allows for an interactive map. You can see exactly what these partnerships are and where the funding is. We disaggregate them also by pre-feasibility funding, project finance, and trade agreements. But overall, we can also look at these sectors and how they shape up by, again, what is an MOU, a diplomatic overture in gray, and where did we actually see funding come out of this? And this is part of this experiment that we ran. Again, the top three sectors, hydrogen, minerals, and nuclear. That would seem to be the main emphasis, at least from the last administration. We found that hydrogen, though, there were no observed market-shaping incentives to de-risk the supply chain for electrolyzers, platinum and palladium metals in particular. And that was perhaps not the best use of political capital. Hydrogen today has bearish sentiments, particularly in the green hydrogen market. And it did very little to actually strengthen U.S. industry, to strengthen our supply chain risks. But conversely, minerals and nuclear, there was a level of follow-up, a specific level of ambition that was demonstrated. There was significant funding being unleashed for minerals across the world. Advanced nuclear reactors got pledges from DFC and XM for projects in East Asia, in Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe. And of course, there were important multilateral and minilateral architectures built for those sectors. The Mineral Security Partnership, which hopefully Abigail Hunter can speak to in the next panel, and also the Sapporo 5 agreement on nuclear, which is a joint effort from the Americans, the Canadians, the Japanese, French, and the Brits to develop a supply chain for small modular reactors. This is a very specific and concerted effort that we emphasize as an important way to think going forward about mutually unlocking supply chain developments as well as points of mutual strength. I come to geothermal down there, where a lot of our findings in this report and our forthcoming research following this project will focus efforts on. We believe this is a high opportunity for the United States. There was not a lot of diplomacy. Some last-minute efforts were done with the Europeans that we highlight in the report. But we did see certain levels of funding. It comes from USTDA for pre-feasibility, comes from DFC, and we even see funding from USTDA for a next-gen geothermal project in the Philippines, where we really believe the high opportunity is. Unsurprisingly, SAF, industrial decarb, shipping are nascent, high technology risk, no real funding measures. All of this research we've shown you today, whether on supply chains, innovation, or foreign policy mapping, culminates into this one graphic that you can find in the paper, How the U.S. Can Stop Losing the Race for Clean Energy. It's on pages 11 and 12. And what it does is it takes our technology verticals and it asks 5 critical questions. 1, does the U.S. have domestic industrial potential to manufacture these technologies here at home that satiate a certain quotient of our projected demand? 2, is there a supply chain risk, namely from a foreign entity of concern, that could disrupt this development? 3, is there an innovation opportunity? To what extent can American industry develop next-gen technology capable of supplanting the incumbent and perhaps some of those supply chain risks? 4, national priority. In purely realist terms, does this technology have dual-use spillovers to sectors of national security relevance or macroeconomic importance, say the agricultural sector? And then lastly, we call global net zero market. This is the potential market opportunity in a net zero scenario. Some of these verticals, the conventional bankable electrification technologies, have a low gap to net zero because there are so many factories either online or already in pipeline that we're actually pretty close to those goals. Other sectors like geothermal, clean ammonia, sustainable aviation fuels, and electrolyzers are quite far. There's a big gap to net zero, implying a big opportunity. I'll run through briefly just how we rationalize this with one sector, and that's batteries. That's, again, kind of an area of excitement and focus. Batteries have a high industrial base. There is an enormous amount of battery cell manufacturing coming online in the United States. But there is an immense supply chain risk, both from spherical graphite and active anode material, but also active materials writ large in chemical production. There is enormous innovation opportunity, both for the mobility sector and the grid sector. We see and highlight specifically lithium metal and lithium sulfur architectures, which we'll be speaking about later today, as well as a wave of novel ways of storing energy, including under the ground and geopressurized systems, which we'll also speak about today. From there, batteries have a national priority. They are used in NASA satellites. They are used across a wave of military hardware. So there's this implicit concerted reason to perhaps hold on to that from Washington. And they have an average, a moderate gap to net zero. So thus our recommendation is to both leapfrog into these next-gen technologies and also to friendshore upstream. That's to say, promote this next-gen tech here and abroad to phase out the need for the incumbent technologies from China, all the while bolstering efforts for mineral diplomacy, given that these will be long-term processes. We do not think that this will be something that can happen overnight. Yeah, recommend checking out the rest of it, and I'll leave with just some concluding remarks of our final policy recommendations. 1, focus industrial policy on leapfrog opportunities while using foreign policy to expand markets and drive joint R&D for future developments. 2, as Bentley mentioned, strengthen PGI with clear supply chain goals and targets and a foreign policy approach to match. Lastly, establish an interagency process such as the energy security partnerships, and Katie Auth has a fantastic report outlining what this could look like, to create a pipeline of bankable projects for overseas deployment. And lastly, expand the role of DFC and Exim, both of which are up for reauthorization, to help make more effective tools in deploying capital beyond these diplomatic overtures. I want to end with just saying thank you to all for being here. Thank you to those in the task force. It's been a joy and a pleasure working with you. We have a great set of panelists speaking on supply chain security, the future of trade and clean energy, and then American clean energy industry and industrial strength. So thank you all. Look forward to continuing this during the coffee.
Are we sitting down here?
Went all the way around.
All right.
I'll stick you in the middle, Chrissy.
Nice. Wait to be invited up. I don't hear
We
because
ended
I'm
up with
getting older.
gender separation.
Wherever you like.
Oh, did we? Yeah,
That's
we
funny.
should switch somebody.
Abby, you want to switch real quick? Because we're weirdly.
Otherwise, it's like men.
Okay, everybody, welcome to our first panel titled
fine.
Securing American Supply Chains. After this, we have a fireside chat and then a third panel on winning the clean energy race. I want to introduce the great panelists we have here today. At the end is Kate Gordon, a non-resident scholar at Carnegie, California, the CEO of California Forward, and formerly a senior advisor to Secretary Granholm in the Department of Energy. Samira Fazeli is a senior fellow at the Roosevelt Institute and was previously deputy director of the National Economic Council during the Biden administration. Chrissy Harbin is an energy and trade advisor to Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, Republican. Abby Hunter is the executive director of the SAFE Center for Critical Mineral Strategy. And Dave Banks is a fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center and was the chief strategist to the Republican side of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. We're going to start with an icebreaker. We're kind of in the middle of the day, but we'll break the ice on this panel with something I borrow from the climate podcast Shift Key, you guys may know from Heat Map, that Rob Meyer and Jesse Jenkins do. They do upshift and downshift, where you can choose something that makes you optimistic or pessimistic about U.S. clean energy. So depends how happy or sad you want to be today. Kate, I'm going to go down to you at the end. Either one, happy, sad, what do you have for the group?
Wow. I would love to be happy, but I'm going to go the other way. Worrying about just the incredible uncertainty and just day-to-day changes in market conditions when it comes to companies investing in this space.
All right, then I'll go happy. I'll go happy because people have often said that supply chain expansions or industrial policy can't work, but over the past just 2 to 3 years, we expanded lithium processing capacity in the U.S. 85 times, are on track to expand it by 2030 85 times, graphite 25 times. We have whole new industries being built out in the U.S., most of those in Republican congressional districts. I think it's like 200,000 jobs just in clean energy manufacturing in the U.S., so I'm bullish that there's momentum behind us economically, that we learned that the policy environment can really pull in private investment and lead to new expansions in the U.S. Of course, I share the concerns of my colleague here, Kate, that we're at real risk of going backwards, but I'm hopeful that we can keep the momentum and find ways to move forward.
I'm happy to. I find it very encouraging to see growing consensus across political parties and across industry on some of the challenges that are facing this country, both in domestic investment as well as the unfair competition we face from abroad. And so it may not come across in headlines, news headlines, because it's easier to highlight the conflict, but I do think within the policymaking community there's a growing interest in a coordinated approach in solving these issues.
Maybe I'll tee it up to the sunshine outside, but I'm also happy today. I think that Bentley said kind of the focus on the supply chain, building out, particularly for critical minerals, which is what I spend an outsized amount of my time thinking about. I think in the next 4 years, we have a great opportunity to actually elevate the supply chain conversations, make a difference in an area that is intentionally a very long, multi-decade sector, and to have a little bit of speed and transactional nature to build it out, hopefully the right way, adhering to the right standards, and ensuring a level playing field will result in greater returns on the deployment side of clean energy, which I know is what we're focused on in this panel.
Well, measured happy, in the sense that, look, I mean, so I'm going to agree with the feeling that, or the sense that there is an emerging consensus related to the challenges that we face, cutting across manufacturing, trade, energy, environment policy. I'm not suggesting it's going to be an easy process for us. I think it's going to be really hard. But that's not a surprise. I think that we should certainly expect there to be a lot of bumps along the way, but I think we'll get through it. That's hence why I'm happy that we'll come out on the other side with a stronger American manufacturing industrial policy.
All right, we got 4 optimistic ones, and I'm going to come back to you, Chrissy and Dave, on the trade
I'm feeling
carbon border
lonely down
side.
here in my kind of black haze of
Well, you're
pessimism.
thinking short term. Right? You're thinking of all the problems we're going to go through up front. I get it.
Just a note on programming, we'll have about 45 minutes of discussion with this bipartisan panel before we take questions from the audience, both in the room and online. Samir, I wanted to go back to you because you were in the White House during the COVID pandemic working on supply chain resilience when we needed important goods like ventilators. Are there lessons from that time that we can apply to clean energy? And is there, what's the balance between thinking about competitiveness and resilience, having been through COVID?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest takeaway from that, and I think it really builds off what people just said here, is that there is cross-partisan or transpartisan appeal on trying to create more secure, resilient supply chains for the US economy. Everybody recognizes now that supply chains have macroeconomic consequences and national security implications as well. It's not just politicians in Washington and policy wonks talking about it. It became kitchen table conversation and remains kitchen table conversation. What's going on with supply chains? The business community, while I was in the White House, was constantly coming to us like, this is the structure of global supply chains right now. It was designed for efficiency and low cost, not reliability and resilience, and we, the business community, cannot fix it. So the business community was calling government to play a role kind of addressing what is a systemic risk to them, to the economy. And so I think that made me really, that's a key lesson that I took away. And then in the public, it brings together, the reason people call it transpartisan and cross-partisan is it brings together people of all types interested in solving this problem. Labor unions are really mobilized to solve it, local economic development professionals, kind of consumer rights groups, environmentalists, you name it, people want to work together on this issue. So what I learned is that there is really, really great opportunity, but I'm not going to overstate the consensus here. People don't know what we should do about it yet. So it's a place where there's a lot of policy experimentation going on right now on what's the right toolkit government should be using, whether it's actual policies or it's convening and coordination powers. And I will say my experience working on this task force just reemphasized that people were not ideology first, they were outcomes first. No matter what sector you represented or what party you were coming from. So those are some key takeaways I had from working on a ton of both supply chain emergencies from my time at the White House, as well as trying to build out a policy apparatus that could help us build out semiconductor supply chain, digitally secure supply chains, and clean energy supply chains.
No, just really briefly on this, because I think it's important. I was in the California governor's office during COVID, so that was an experience. But I think both that, everything Samira said, and climate impact supply chain crises are just growing. I mean, we in California see that all the time, but it's happening all over the world. I don't think that issue does get enough attention in thinking about the rationale for the conversations we're having today. Those are increasing, they're increasingly severe. They're going to keep increasing and being increasingly severe. And actually, my experience working on climate resilience is that it also is a very bipartisan issue, even though it has the word climate in it. It's something that people experience very much in places and at the industry level, and in particularly critical industries where there's a lot of capital investment. So I think that's another piece of the puzzle that is driving us toward this conversation.
So lessons beyond clean energy then. Maybe a follow-up for you, Kate. As Milo was saying in our report, we talk about which clean energy sectors the U.S. should seek to onshore and friendshore. And I know you've written in your Substack about making sure that if we do onshoring, that the jobs are good jobs, not crappy jobs, and that they stick around. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think a lot of what I've worked on over the years, and including at the Department of Energy and in California, has been on energy transition and also just industrial transition. There's places that have a thing, so whether that thing is that they do fossil fuels, like coal communities did a lot of work on that in the Biden White House or with the Biden White House. In California, oil and gas communities, agriculture communities, timber communities, like there's a lot, and of course industry, factory communities. What the worst way to deal with that is to do investment into a place that then is unstable, right? So if we have a strategy that's like, we want to take every industrial community and have all of them do this thing that may or may not be competitive, right? If it's not competitive, then when that particular subsidy goes away, that community is right exactly back where they were. And what that does is both, it's incredibly destructive to the tax base, to workers, and to the community, but it also just frankly undermines political will for the entire endeavor. So I think that we have to be really, really thoughtful about doing not just these projects at a very high level, sort of chess pieces on a board saying this should go here, this should go here, but being really thoughtful about the durability of the policy support. If something is in our national interest and we're going to keep subsidizing it, let's be very clear about the long-term nature of those subsidies or that national interest. If it's something that we don't think is going to get those kinds of like DoD subsidies, for instance, then we need to be really clear about, as the report does, and I think this task force has done, what pieces of it are in fact competitive, what pieces of it aren't. That's not a conversation that's happening as much as it should be, and frankly, most of it happens at the local economic development level. I mean, that's who's making those decisions, basically. States and economic development agencies are making the decisions of sort of what to prioritize, what to attract in terms of foreign direct investment, how to think about long-term competitiveness. I think that conversation has to happen with states. And on a final point on that, those projects also can't be projects that aren't good for the community. I mean, again, something is an anchor for a community. If you bring in a project like a mining project, for instance, usually those communities don't have a lot of other stuff going on in them. It becomes an economic anchor. It's really important that it's an anchor that is creating a solid tax base, that is creating good jobs, that does have pathways into those jobs. Because again, that's partly political, it's partly building out a stronger economy, a more diversified economy. We're not going to be resilient in the face of all the things we're talking about if we have massive inequality either, right? We're not going to be resilient if we don't have a distributed and diversified economy. So I think it's kind of got to be an all-together strategy, which means that by definition, it's not just a federal strategy. It's also a state and frankly, in a place like California or Texas or Florida, huge states, Ohio, New York, it has to be a regional economic development strategy too.
Really well said on the need for prioritization. You mentioned minerals, so I want to turn to Abby, our mining expert. You gave a great presentation to the task force where you talked about the key elements of U.S. foreign policy for minerals today. And I wonder if you could share that for the group. You know, Milo put up the map of general partnerships for clean energy. What are the most important elements of U.S. foreign policy for minerals?
So the last 6 or so years, you've seen a huge emergence of crowding in of G7 plus or global south to global south partnerships around critical minerals. This is a very sexy topic, and there's an opportunity affiliated with it for economic development, for clean energy transition. But there's also the concern of, you know, the social acceptability of these doing things, the historical legacy that's a little bit murky for mining, and the concerns around resource curse, right? And so you have lots of different groups. When we did the presentation a few months ago, it outlined, I think, over a dozen, and I don't purport to even have all of them covered, that are different iterations of this and also have similar limited mechanisms to deliver on their very ambitious initiatives. So I think the future of this for this administration, I hope that they take some of those projects and, you know, do more with them, right? You have lists of different G7 plus countries that are willing to engage on what can be a geopolitically isolating topic, right? For the fear of reaction from China if you're already kind of import or export reliant, selling to the biggest monopoly power in town. And so looking to kind of those groupings of countries and saying, okay, you're willing to engage with the Western world, with the United States on these issues so that we can build more resilient, secure, higher standard supply chains, that should be a good list for this administration to tackle. And I think it's really important to kind of still maintain that crowding in that bigger group of multinational countries while we see this administration do a lot on the bilateral, like the ongoing Ukraine minerals deal that's happening this week, the continuing conversation around Greenland, whatever that looks like, and then bilateral conversations with Canada. It doesn't matter if you have secured these resources through a really transactional minerals deal if it's not economic, as Bentley said, for you to develop those projects that have been sitting there, you know, without our attention for the past decades. It doesn't mean that the infrastructure, the surrounding infrastructure needed to justify the investment is there. It doesn't mean the investment's there, right? It doesn't mean that we have the national champions in the United States or the financial sector that are actually going to crowd in around these projects. You need all of this all together, and you need to ensure that other countries aren't letting the lower standard, highly subsidized material seep in and continue to distort the projects that you're now throwing more US taxpayers around. So hopefully we can kind of find our footing there. I think that the purported tariff wall that this administration wants to institute could be a mechanism to solve for this, but we're very early in seeing what that looks like. There's going to be reports coming out of the Department of Commerce and USTR on that, but I'm optimistic that we can hopefully still maintain that really effective grouping of countries so that it's even for the rest of the world, and we actually have sustainable, right-priced minerals for the clean energy transition, but for everything we rely on today, right? The lights in this room, the TV screen we're appearing on.
You mentioned tariffs, and you know this panel is about supply chains, but you can't have a conversation about supply chains without talking about trade measures. Tariffs are certainly popular with this White House. Dave, I wanted to ask you if you think that this White House could support some sort of carbon border measure or fee on foreign pollution in the next couple of years.
So the answer is yes. They wouldn't call it a carbon border adjustment mechanism, right? I don't think there's a lot of appetite for that sort of thing. And look, and when you're talking about this issue, you really have to separate the climate piece from the trade part. And I know that what the administration's currently doing with the climate programming is pretty controversial with a lot of folks. But on this particular issue, I think it's important for people to recognize that, yes, I mean, of course, the president is a climate skeptic. Everyone, I mean, it's well known. It's not a secret. But he's not an ideologue when it comes to climate-related issues, right? He's always looked at climate policy through the lens of what does this do to U.S. competitiveness, U.S. manufacturing, and so if you can kind of flip the script on its head, and by the way, and those kind of concerns obviously are shared widely across the Republican Party and are rooted, all the way back into the Kyoto debate. But if you can flip the script and you can create a policy design that actually allows the United States to monetize its relative carbon efficiency / carbon advantage, then it changes the entire conversation. So that's one thing. And then on the trade side, I think it's pretty clear. And a lot of folks who are coming in into the senior trade team are part of Bob Lighthizer sort of ecosystem alumni network. And I think it's well known that Ambassador Lighthizer was incredibly supportive of this concept, very supportive of the concept for decades. I'll let folks know. So he's viewed the poor environmental standards, enforcement, and compliance as a unfair trade practice / subsidy that has harmed U.S. competitiveness. He's viewed that as the case for a long time. And so, I think that view is shared widely among the folks on the trade side. So, and by the way, an important distinction when it comes to sort of the energy environment folks and the trade people is that the energy environment folks get caught up in this whole conversation around carbon. The trade people generally just look at the numbers and just really identifying strongly with the unfair trade practice piece of this. So yeah, I mean, I think that you can get into a conversation about what kind of policies we actually need to create an effective foreign pollution fee. I would probably argue, and this is kind of Chrissy's turf here, argue that we do need new legislation, or we need a modernized trade statute in this space. But then also, I mean, we have existing authorities that I believe, and a lot of people would agree with, where we could build a case related to this specific going under countervailing duty laws. So yes, I mean, I think it's very possible. I'm expecting some type of action if I were going to bet on it related to this, because with the America First Trade Memorandum that came out on day one, it's not just reviewing existing agreements, but it's also reviewing how we practice international trade law, how we interpret existing law, existing statute, and just questioning have we actually made the most of it. So yeah, so I'm actually pretty optimistic about that, about the possibility, as long as you keep it separate from the climate agenda.
Yeah, we might get climate action as a co-benefit or some good side effects to drop the jargon. But Chrissy, Dave teed you up perfectly. You're working on a particular carbon border measure or competitiveness measure. Can you introduce the Foreign Pollution Fee Act to the group?
Yeah, thank you. No, I work for Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, and I'm refining a priority piece of legislation that he has put a lot of focus on, and it's the Foreign Pollution Fee Act, which I think addresses, it aims to solve a number of the challenges that you noted in your opening remarks, and Bentley, you discussed them too in your remarks. Some of the challenges about how do we strengthen our partnerships with other countries in order to counter unfair competition? Both developing economies as well as well-industrialized countries. How do we work together in reciprocal arrangements to help our U.S. producers and our trading partners compete? How do we shore up all these insecure supply chains? Stuff that you talked about, I think very well, Abigail, and there are some real challenges in that piece. So what this bill does is it measures the difference in embedded emissions intensity in U.S. products versus their foreign counterparts, and then charges a fee on that pollution at the border. It does not include a domestic component. While I will talk at length about all the growing consensus between political parties, I think that does remain one sticking point. But I do find in my conversations with industry partners, both from Louisiana and from across the country as they come in and counsel me and as we craft this plan, as well as in conversations at the member level and the staff level, within Republican offices and also with our friends on the left as well. There is a growing interest in leveraging trade policy to help U.S. manufacturers compete and counter all this unfair competition. I find that this is strikingly very well aligned with the incoming trade team, as Dave noted. We recently had a round of senior Trump officials come through for their confirmations, and I thought it was quite striking to hear their openness to this policy. I think Dave is exactly right that these folks that are coming in aren't ideologues. You know, they have a focus on outcomes. And I watched these hearings and staffed my boss for these hearings with active interest, noting how Scott Bessent, now Secretary of Treasury, said that this could be part of a tariff regime, looking at a carbon border measure. I also thought it was interesting to hear Howard Lutnick also talk about the challenge, the problems of other countries spewing coal into the air. I think that was, I'm paraphrasing, but those were his words. U.S. companies do it cleaner, and we should be facilitating a global playing field that helps them do so.
All right, it sounds like we might see a Republican Congress advance a climate trade measure in the next couple of years. We keep coming back to
But can I just, because
Yeah, please
earlier
come
you
in.
were saying, and I think Milo walked through in the previous panel, all the places of bipartisanship. The Biden trade team also thought of how do you leverage trade policy levers to strengthen U.S. manufacturing and to level the playing field on our higher road environmental and labor standards. So this is also a point of continuity between the two administrations, that there's just a new approach and a new regime, I think, coming in play here in DC, that international trade is, the trade tools need to be reapplied, rethought, redesigned a little bit for this moment of strategic competition. And a lot of it centers around trade is part of economic policy. For a long time, people just thought about the geostrategic relationships you're building through a trade policy, and you have a lot of consensus between the two administrations on, and I think amongst some folks on the Hill, that we have to have a little bit of an economics first approach, or an economic first approach brings a lot of advantages here to the U.S. and our domestic economy.
Let me reinforce this consensus point, because I think that's a really important thing to lay out there for folks. So when we first started working on this, it was actually a little before the Biden administration. We were having this debate within BPC. Do you need a price on carbon to have a border carbon adjustment or not? And at the time, most people were saying, "Oh, you got to have a price on carbon." And we kind of worked our way through that process and finally landed in actually you don't. You can use emissions performance as your metric. Carbon intensity is your metric. And I think that with the Biden folks, I think we're definitely getting there at the end, right? Because you had that debate too. Do you need a price on carbon or not? But yeah, so this is, I mean, once you kind of clear that hurdle that you don't need a price on carbon, that you can just use emissions intensity as your metric, it changes the dynamic.
Yeah. And I mean, again, I will not be overly optimistic. Let me add a dose of realism. Like, the people in both parties who are saying things like this are cutting across orthodoxies in both of our parties, free market fundamentalists and free trade fundamentalists, who still have a lot of power in both political parties, frankly.
Yeah, but they're losing, at least on our side.
No, I hope so. I think a lot of us look at like J.D. Vance and the things that he pushed as a senator, and we hope with him as vice president, he can help be part of this conversation about rethinking trade, rethinking industrial policy. Don't be markets first, and don't only listen to billionaires to tell you how to run the economy, but.
Well, I will say this, a big difference between the first term and second term for Trump is that there were a lot of free trade folks in the administration up front. That is not the case today. And I guarantee you, so Koch Industries may still have a fair amount of influence over U.S. energy climate thinking because of all the decades they've been working in the space. They have zero influence today over Trump trade policy.
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment about carbon intensity accounting, which is, I know, a little in the weeds, but important. Something that is going to be really important is consistency of accounting. And I do think this is going to be a conversation, because there's been a move toward accounting, as folks know, that's broadened it out quite a lot. The move towards sort of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, carbon intensity, carbon accounting has taken hold in Europe. There are people, now putting those policies in place. California has a disclosure law that has been passed but not implemented that would require companies doing business in California to do that kind of accounting. At the same time, there's, I think, a pretty compelling side conversation happening around the idea that carbon accounting needs to be cleaner than that we need to have something that does accounting at the level of corporate control if we're actually going to be putting systems in place that have to do with disclosure and for systems that are, in law, right? That are not just voluntary. There's that whole interesting sort of side project going on. It's called sort of e-liabilities, about doing a different kind of accounting that's much more within the control of individual companies. This is a big debate in the carbon world, and I think a really important one. And I say that because in California, we were the first people to put a buy clean policy in place. Folks may remember we put a buy clean policy in place 8 years ago or something on certain types of goods coming into the state. And that policy was nearly impossible to implement because other countries did not have a consistent approach to accounting. And so it was impossible for procurement contractors to know how to balance something against something else. And I think fundamentally that's who's going to be making these determinations are people who have to count stuff. And so that will be really important too.
Yeah, that conversation, I agree, it's well underway. And I think that's where industry is currently having the conversation. How do we measure our embedded emissions? How does it compare with our foreign counterparts? How do we trust this data too, right? And so to your point earlier about, the positive transpartisan policy programs that have been stood up and lasted across administrations. I'll give the Climate and Trade Task Force that the Biden administration stood up credit for a lot of good work in starting the process for understanding what the data is. I think it's really well aligned with the Prove It Act, a fiercely bipartisan bill that saw a good pathway in this past Congress. I think at the end of, it had 40 sponsors, 20 Republicans and 20 Democrats on the House side, and strong support from Senator Coons and Senator Kramer. So those are some reasons why, as I noted earlier, I'm very optimistic that we can find a consensus position, a US-led framework that works well for our manufacturers, but totally agree with you. I mean, we've moved past this thought exercise, this period of how can this work? Could we ever leverage our trade policy to advance other objectives? And now we're actually trying to figure out how to do it.
And that's progress, to go from could we,
It's
should
huge
we,
progress.
to how do we.
All right,
Can I
now
give
I'm
a-
optimistic.
A materials example to this.
Yeah,
I
go
know
ahead, Abby.
we've gone kind of down a diatribe here, but just from, if you take, I wrote my master's thesis on aluminum, which is transcended 3, if not more, administrations to deal with the overcapacity that we have from China because they're producing so much aluminum using subsidies, indirect subsidies, and direct subsidies to help, and they're predominantly using them on the coal side because 40% of aluminum cost is electricity, and so when the price for aluminum is low enough that you would say, okay, maybe I should be curtailing my production and not making this right now, China was still pumping out more and more because they were able to pump really, really highly subsidized coal in. China aluminum is 57% of the market as of 2023 when I wrote this paper. They emitted about 1 to 2% of GHG from aluminum, global greenhouse gas emissions just from aluminum smelting alone. And while the Biden administration was trying to counter the overcapacity through the global arrangement of sustainable steel and aluminum, which was born out of the Trump 232 tariffs, Europe and the United States were middle of the pack at worst, depending on the smelter, can be a little bit better in terms of the emissions profile of what we're doing for primary aluminum. But if we need to actually have an impact on emissions and make sure that these companies are competing on a level playing field, it is to come together and counter China through some type of emissions border tariff. And we import a lot of aluminum in this country too, mostly from Canada, but from other sources as well. And so really important to kind of make sure that you're watching the import side of this as well as our domestic production. The last thing I'll say, and this is really important about the whole supply chain picture, we're talking about these new forms of energy are in themselves energy intensive. They require a lot of energy to make them. And so the biggest challenge US aluminum producers face today is reliable, affordable, ideally clean sources of energy that they can use to be competitive globally. All of the hydroelectricity abundant aluminum producers have been able to be resilient to China's oversupply on the market. The US hasn't fared as well. So when we're thinking about standing up these industries at home and making sure they're competitive, we need these 100%. Border tariffs, but we also need policies at home that actually make sure that they're competitive too. It has to be a yes and.
Yeah.
You see how wonky some of our task force discussions got, and also how much bipartisan agreement we get even in these contentious times. I want to turn away from trade and go to foreign investment for a second. It's sort of a question maybe for Abby and Kate. I mean, Abby, before you presented to the task force, you testified to the U.S. International Trade Commission saying America cannot meet its mineral needs through domestic resources alone. Bentley made a similar point earlier. And in the green room, Kate and I were talking about today's cancellation of Power Africa, this program where the U.S. was investing to reduce energy poverty in Africa, including in countries like Zambia that have a lot of mineral resources. And I suppose the question is this a mistake? I mean, shouldn't the U.S. be investing in countries that could help it achieve the mineral dominance that President Trump wants to achieve, for either of you?
So I think the USAID question and Power Africa, I do think there's a lot of challenges to kind of creating a vacuum there, and I hope they navigate that. But that doesn't mean that we have no other funding programs that exist, right? And other people on this panel can speak as well as me, especially Chrissy and Kate, on our International Development Finance Corporation, our Export-Import Bank, USTDA for early stage, early development projects to a certain degree. I think this administration is intending to leverage those programs that they gave Exim the largest reauth in history. They created DFC out of the BUILD Act, changing it from OPEC, changed its mandate a bit. So I think we'll see kind of that supplement hopefully come into this. But I think the root of your question that's so important is these are really expensive challenges that we're facing. And we do not have the resources at home to the degree that we need them for our own demand and our desire to be globally competitive in producing the technologies of the future. To the extent that we do have them, it's hard to permit them in this country. You're seeing a lot of action on the permitting front. Maybe we'll rectify some of that. But ultimately, what we need to do is be investing, and I think they'll do this, they're investing in projects in the upstream and in the midstream, in the processing, refining, smelting, if we can't get those processes in the United States. Otherwise, we're not going to actually be able to absorb the materials that we're investing in, right? And to the point of kind of leverage and engaging in the global conversation, if you're not the buyer of these materials, then you're going to have a hard time pushing, a carbon agenda, a high standard agenda, and a economic competitiveness agenda abroad, because who cares? You don't buy this from me. Somebody else buys this from me. And by the way, they give me a way sweeter deal than you do. So I hope that we see kind of the strategic organization around all of our funding agencies towards specific projects with partners, because again, if we take a bunch of minority stakes in projects, we may not achieve what we're hoping to. We need to have the $1 billion fund that Italy has put out, the $1 billion fund that France has put out, the $1 billion fund that Germany has put out, the new one Korea has put out, also putting stakes in these projects, working together with us on the technology gaps in the midstream, and making sure that ultimately we have this alternative, ex-China, more resilient supply chain.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of things about this, so I'll try to keep it short. But first of all, I think it's odd to do things like cancel Power Africa, given I know the new secretary, Chris Wright, energy secretary, is very interested in kind of energy access, energy equity globally. And so it does seem like a kind of flies in the face of that a little bit. But I also, it might be a place where I'm a little bit more domestic focused than others. I really think we need to build this stuff out here. I really do. Because of geopolitics, because of the climate impacts I was talking about before, getting all of these materials from the global south is going to be an issue, both geopolitically and from a climate standpoint. I also think, to your point you were just making, we also need to build out the rest of the supply chain here. I mean, it's really important for us to be thinking about where do we have critical minerals? I mean, and I'm in a state that has them. So where do we have critical minerals? We have 2 big lithium mines in California. Where can we then build out processing and manufacturing on the battery supply chain? Where can we then build out we already have the consumer base, frankly. So we've got the pull already. And then where can we build out recycling in a really big way so that we're not as dependent on raw material mining? Feels like a critical project from a geopolitical, economic, and climate impact and shock perspective, and from the perspective of building out, economies that are more stable in rural parts of the country, which is where, again, many of these mines are. I do think, and this is why I and others worked so hard on this during the Biden administration, you're right that permitting has been a challenge. It's going to continue to be a challenge until we have deals on the ground with these projects that create real benefits to workers and communities. The reason we did the community benefits structure at DOE was literally to get more mining and manufacturing into the United States, into communities that were not seeing the benefit, we're only seeing the pollution. We're not seeing benefits of these, needed to see that we could create benefits from these projects in order to permit them and cite them. I don't think we get those on the ground deals unless we have a real consistent approach. Because we've spent 40, 50 years in a situation in many states where we've offshored all this stuff. So people are used to saying, oh, we invent it, we install it, we don't see any of the dirty parts of it. If you have that condition for the last 40 years, there's no culture or positive economy built around this stuff. So we have to actually demonstrate it, I think. And that's just a really important piece of the puzzle that I do worry about, the sort of wholesale throwing out of the community benefit structures. Luckily, a number of companies are still doing them, but we kind of do need that piece in order to see this stuff permitted and cited and done in a way that reduces litigation risk, frankly, and protest.
I know this wasn't the question, but if I can just add on the permitting piece, and this is something I'll say to you guys that I've heard from investors, and then maybe you can continue amplifying it to the administration. The issue here isn't about speed. Yes, there's an urgency to supply chain needs today, but getting these projects done, a successful permitting process requires objectivity of process, clarity of process, and ability to actually execute the process. The clarity of the process piece, to your point, Kate, is defining the stakeholders who are implicated and should be engaged in the project, having stakes in the project, being at the table, involved in the conversation throughout the entire way, because social acceptability is a dynamic thing. It is not a static thing, right? We saw this with FQM in Panama, some challenges there. So you need to have that baked in, and then you need to actually be able to do it without kind of the political back and forth. As the nonpartisan person on this panel, I can say that, the whiplashing, because in 4 years, investors I talk to about this sector say, well, I'm not gonna, the ones we want investing say, I'm not gonna invest if they just eliminate permits altogether, because then I'm gonna be sued for the next several years. Yeah. And it's really about, okay, make it clear and consistent and making me actually believe that I can build something here without the pushback from the community that has created a lot of challenges in litigation in the past.
We're starting to get, Chris, I want to come to you. We're starting to get audience questions, so we'll take those in about 5 minutes. You can use the QR codes if you're online. You can use a YouTube chat, or I'll call on you if you're in the room. But Chrissy, permitting, I mean, your boss is also on energy and natural resources. Anything from Congress about that?
Yeah, again, and I think this comes back to something that we were briefly talking about, which is a oversimplification and oversimplified mischaracterization of where the political parties are at. And my boss sits on the Finance Committee and also the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, which plays a very important role in this permitting reform conversation. In permitting reform, there's an ongoing interest among the Republican majority, working closely with Ranking Member Heinrich and others in continuing to solve these challenges that we're all discussing. So I know that from that perspective, it's still very much alive. I do want to note, I know we're going to move to a note about, you were talking about business certainty, and you were talking about the disconnected or the lack of coordination across the international trade agencies. I think I want to refer back to the trade EO. I do think the fact that President Trump's trade memoranda earlier this year directing different agencies to take an inventory of their authorities and see what they can do to help advance these shared goals bodes well. I think staffing is going to be an issue. When I served at the U.S. Export-Import Bank in the first Trump term, and we really didn't get staffed up until like the second year, third year, which meant that we didn't have a lot of time to work on these challenges. I think that we can expect to see greater coordination from the Trump trade team this time around.
So Yeah, I'm reflecting on actually what Bentley said earlier in his segment, that countries have choices right now. And so this break it all now so we can rebuild it, we might be able to build a more efficient, coordinated, integrated system here in the US. But that's not how it's going to be perceived by our partners abroad who we are trying to set up relationships with. And relationships like these projects are going to move at the speed of trust. We don't have a lot of trust. Like when I came into the Biden administration, it took, I don't know, I'm looking at like Greta and Peter here in the audience, like 2 years to have some of our diplomatic partners even want to work with us again, because and it's not because of what Trump did, it's that US policy and US policy changes so radically depending on who's in power, and we're in a moment in which control is shifting quite frequently, whether on the Hill or in the executive branch. So I think we are losing credibility with the very partners we want to work with to build these secure and reliable supply chains. Second, since leaving the Biden administration, I left after the first 2 years, I've done a lot of global engagements, and these developing countries especially that have the natural resources, that want to be upstream or midstream in the supply chain with us, they want the US private sector. They want the US investors, they want the US companies, they want the US R&D and know-how. But a lot of it has to do with like the US private sector or like US universities. But the US government is the one that's carrying all this risk for them. And at the same time, our companies don't want to go in these countries until our government gives them some political cover, insurance, something. And so it's a real chicken and egg problem. I hope that later this year you have like reauthorizations happening for the Development Finance Corporation, for the Export-Import Bank, and I think it'll offer an opportunity for there to be a little bit more of a conversation about how foreign aid and foreign investment actually are part of our domestic competitiveness strategy, how they actually advance jobs in America, R&D in America, job growth in America, good job growth, not just any jobs. Because I think we need to have that conversation, and it could also create the new kind of authorities and streamlining and coordination that we all hope can happen more in these international development, international trade and finance agencies as well.
I have a lot more questions, but I'm going to give folks in the room a chance to jump in. It's been a while before the first coffee break. So just please raise your hand and I'll call on you. We have Emily. Well, introduce yourself, but I know Emily. Emily, stand up. Yeah, it's right there.
You. Hi, thank you. No, I think it's not on.
Perfect, thanks. Emily Benson here in a personal capacity. I have a question about the future of a China trade agreement. It sounds like there are early conversations in the White House about potentially putting that back on the table as a means of turning the temperature down. In that case, how do we square the circle on ex-China clean energy supply chains?
That's not a me question.
So, does anyone want to answer?
Go ahead.
When it comes to minerals supply chains, a deal with China is in my opinion, the easy button. It's a lot easier to work with a country and strike a deal that's already producing a massive amount of these materials. Whether or not that aligns with China's kind of ultimate goal here, which is trying to be this export-oriented economy, the builders of the future technologies and selling those to the rest of the world, that's yet to be seen. But that is something that we're observing from a distance and kind of monitoring carefully. It's a lot easier than striking a deal with Ukraine, getting resources that are not yet in production to the United States to sell to processors that are not currently in production, or annexing Canada and getting their minerals, or whatever kind of deal is struck with Greenland that is, yes, getting warmer, and so you have more kind of mineral access than you would, but it is a block of ice, and it is hard to access these projects that have been diligenced by a lot of companies already that are maybe not the high grade that we would need to see for a technical perspective. So this is something I'm very cognizant of because, Bentley talked about both the upstream grip that China has on a lot of these projects, the value offering that the resource-rich countries are given by the Chinese government, Chinese investment banks, and SOEs and non-state entities, but then also they're being sold these downstream products that benefit from China's dominance in the upstream and their ability to take losses in resources, in mining, in processing, so they can produce the cheap final good, right, and have that global dominance. And so that's what gives me pause, that, you know, that they can yes and it, and we don't have a grip on either end of those yet, right? So I think it's starting to emerge. We had a 10% tariff on China and a 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico. I think that says a lot. But I hope that whatever has come together has the kind of scrutinization of how these supply chains are currently being leveraged and really cementing global dominance in the export side, and doesn't necessarily further disadvantage our upstream producers in the US, but in other jurisdictions as well.
Dave, did you want to come in before we take one more?
Well, I would just make one political point. I can't imagine any trade agreement with China satisfying, and this cuts across both parties, right? Satisfying the administration's objectives related to supply chain security, but also folks up on the Hill. So I wouldn't assume that any kind of trade agreement with China would sort of derail the efforts, but I think that the U.S., that the Congress and the administration will continue to make in reducing China's control over global supply chains.
Let's take another one from in the room. Over here, please.
Thank you. Hi there, Lily Pike from Foreign Policy Magazine. Thanks for a great panel today. I had a follow-up question to what Emily just said on a Chinese trade deal. I've been hearing that a trade deal could include more Chinese investment here in the U.S. So wanted to ask the panel about, the appetite from the Trump administration for Chinese investment in the U.S. I've heard Trump signal openness to Chinese EV companies coming to the U.S. I just wanted to get your kind of look ahead on that.
This was a conversation backstage, too, about Ford joint ventures. We've seen some Trump executive orders going in the other direction. Anyone want to come in on that, Chinese FDI?
I think it's hard, whether it's the United States or Mexico or, sub-Saharan Africa, it's really hard to tell a country, hey, no, we don't want your money, right? So I see how the posturing around getting investment and job creation here is appetizing. I think that, again, you have to go back to kind of how these companies have been able to be so successful in making those investments, and it's leveraging these upstream disadvantages that we don't want to perpetuate. So there's cause for eyebrow raising there. I also think that, I was at an event yesterday with two of the president's cabinet secretaries focused on this, and it was Chatham House. I'm going to try to be respectful, but you may be able to deduce who they are. But there was such a bullishness on China, such a, hey, the reason we really want to end this war in Russia is because we want peace, but in the Ukraine, because we want peace, but then also simultaneously we're seeing Russia buy more and more Chinese goods, and we don't want to perpetuate that pathway where you have Chinese dominance and then we're losing like global powers to that relationship, right? And so there's this cognizance of the challenges here of the competition with China globally, and so I don't know which way they're going to end up going. I do think that maybe there'll be some type of deal brought to the table, and they'll talk about it. But that's just an observation I would add as well.
Drawing from my conversations on the Senate side, I think Abigail's exactly right that there's a balance, right? I think members have a deep understanding about the important role that foreign direct investment can bring in terms of good manufacturing jobs, right? Like we have in Louisiana, a lot of companies that do have some ownership from, some of our trading partners, like South Korea. We have a lot of Southeast Asian investment in Louisiana. I think that's very good. I think the conversation, at least practically, will probably be around putting safeguards. So in the context of energy taxes, for instance, there's active interest in exploring putting foreign entity of concern definitions on certain tax credits, and that would actively address some of the one concern that you raised, which is the understandable frustration among U.S. clean manufacturers that U.S. CCP-controlled companies are benefiting from these tax provisions that were that's probably outside of the intent of Congress.
Can I say
Thank-
one more thing
Yeah.
quickly? Oh, sorry. Samira.
I want to try to get to some other questions because we have just a few minutes left. And Abby and Chris, you incidentally answered some of the China-related questions from online. But let's take two more at once, try to be brief, and we'll answer them in this final round here. Yeah, over there.
Hello. Great. Hi, Travis Brubaker at E3G. This one's more for Christine. In the Foreign Pollution Fee Act, there's a special consideration for developing markets. I'm wondering how that works with the current administration's, call it maybe lack of interest in those markets. Thanks.
Lack of interest in developing economies?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I would question the source for your question, what you're specifically talking about, and I can speak really only to the perspective of my boss's interest in working with developing economies and ensuring that they can work closely with U.S. producers and deploying the manufacturing that has that has standards that I think follow those that we follow in the U.S. So I guess I would be happy to chat further and understand a little bit more about your question, but I don't know enough to be able to speculate here.
Over there. Let's take one more before the break.
Thank you very much. My name is Ibrani. I'm from the Indonesian Embassy. So my question would be, try to give a little bit background. And sometimes it's not, everything's not about geopolitical. Sometimes our choices as developing countries is often practical. So coming to that point, my question is, how can U.S. compete, for example, with China, if U.S. cannot get the act together, government, private, and academic? This is what actually China somehow is able to do. And from our perspective, being a bipartisan, like we are a free and independent country, we are more than happy to work with the US and with China and with any countries. I think that's the biggest challenges for us in working together with the US is to have all the relevant pentahelix partners to work together. Thank you very much.
Just briefly on that, it's a great question. Briefly on that, and very relevant to what Samira said as well. This is sort of the point of industrial policy, right? China does the 5-year plans to do that, to present a plan that's all the actors together, and it's very clear what's happening for the next 5 years. Doing industrial policy, which the U.S. has not done that much of up until very recently, is that also. And so I guess my answer to that from more of a, frankly, subnational perspective is that one of the positive things that I'm starting to see working both at the state level and at the multi-state regional level is a turn toward doing industrial policy much more aggressively. And when you have a collection of states that have really significant market power, I think you can do a lot with industrial policy. So leave it to others on what's happening at the federal level on this, but I do think that both some of the ongoing investments from the last 5 years, which really were clean energy industrial policy, and now seeing that play out at the state level, for this very reason that companies are saying and countries are saying, we need to see what the plan is. The plan has to be consistent. We don't want it to constantly change. How do we, give us a plan? And I think we're seeing a shift, frankly, toward that, generally in terms of economic development in the U.S.
So I agree with you and a lot of what you said, which is something I amplified up here, that we are not projecting consistency in the way that China does, and that makes it hard for other countries to trust us. Again, I will point to the fact that we have a tax and budget bill that our Congress is debating. They have a choice to make, and it's going to be all Republicans, and they have a choice to make. Are they going to keep clean energy tax credits that will keep this manufacturing boom happening here in the U.S., and then create the market dynamics where the market's driving us to work with Indonesia on nickel and other parts of the clean energy supply chain. But our business community here in the U.S. needs that policy certainty, and I hope that we will see those clean energy tax credits and the manufacturing tax credits that are attached to them preserved in this tax fight.
We are out of time, so thanks to the audience. We're going to take a 15-minute coffee break, so you have time to mingle, move between tables like it's a wedding. But let's just end with a round of applause for our panelists today. And we'll begin again at 2:30.
Are we going back there to kick these off? You know?
I don't know. I think they're still hot too.
Very good at being brief.
Thanks.
Not as
It was
good.
better than my presentation, I think. I missed some of yours, but I had the sound going. It seems
What was that last question?